Hey all you readers, writers, and potential Harry Potter fans out there. Today I want to talk about the hero's journey. I'm not going to talk in particular with the terminology of the hero of 1,000 faces because it's a little over the top when you have things like meeting with the goddess and whatnot. It gets a little technical. So instead, I'm going to stick with Christopher Vogler's version of the hero's journey, which dates back to the early 1990s. It's a little easier to follow. So there are 12 stages to the hero's journey. The hero's journey can be particularly helpful when plotting a novel or maybe even a screenplay, particularly when you're thinking about the first third and the last third of your book or film. It's a little less helpful when you're considering the second act or mostly the middle part. And we'll see why in a bit. But it can really help you to look at the overall structure and what's going on with the story. It can help you make sense of things. And once you know more about the hero's journey, then you can really use that structure to break down other films, other books. To talk about the hero's journey, we're going to use Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, by the way. Harry Potter was one of the first books I got mega into, besides Sweet Valley Twins number 36 or 37, Escape from Terror Island. That was my first love. But this series is probably one of my favorite series of books ever. I picked Harry Potter because it's something that most people have read or are pretty familiar with. So if you're going to learn more about the hero's journey, or maybe you want to look at Harry Potter in a different way, then stay tuned. So stage 1 of the hero's journey is called the ordinary world. And this is the part where we get the status quo of the story, the status quo of our protagonist. So we get to see what the so-called sort of ordinary world, the run-of-the-mill, the way things kind of always are for our hero, right? Before they ever get to go on their journey. And in Harry Potter the Sorcerer's Stone, that moment actually sort of happens throughout chapters 1 and 2. So in The Boy Who Lived and in The Vanishing Glass, in these first 2 chapters, you get the setup of this is a world where something's a little, we have these run-of-the-mill like Dursleys who they're kind of no-nonsense people who have a certain way of doing things, and thank you very much. But then we also have interesting things going on in the background that seem not quite so ordinary, not quite so run-of-the-mill. And that's mainly in the first chapter before we ever get to Harry. Harry only appears at the very end of chapter 1. And then once we get to chapter 2 in The Vanishing Glass, we sort of flash forward about 10 or so years, and Harry lives in a cupboard under the stairs. He's kind of miserable. His relatives either ignore him or bully him or mistreat him. They're pretty horrible to him. So that is Harry's ordinary world. It's awful. It sucks. No wonder you would want to get away from it, right? We get a sense of what Harry's everyday, sort of day in, day out life is all about, which is part of why we're sort of eager with Harry to take on the journey he's going to go on, because his regular life sucks. So why wouldn't he want to do something else, right? Stage 2 of the hero's journey is called the call to adventure. And this is when something magical or special or otherwise intrudes upon our protagonist, our hero's life, and almost begs them to do something different with their life or something more interesting. It basically pulls them into the story. It gets the story starting. So you might think of this as the inciting incident. In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, that happens in chapter 3, The Letters from No One. So in The Letters from No One, all of a sudden Harry he gets his first letter ever, it seems like, at the door, addressed to him, but he doesn't get to read it. So we don't get to see who's sending him a letter, even though no one seems to care about him in the whole world. Every time his aunt and uncle try and take away the letters, he keeps getting sent more letters and more letters in the most fantastical ways possible, and they keep trying to escape from getting the letters, and they keep getting more of them. Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, the Dursleys, they try and take Harry, they try to keep him from going on his journey. They try and keep him from getting involved in the story, from finding out he's a wizard. They try their hardest, But the magical forces that want Harry to be a part of this world are so sort of overwhelming that the story has to happen, that Harry finally does get the letter, and that Harry says, you know, you're invited to the School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. This you could say the Call of Adventure sort of continues into the 4th chapter, which is the Keeper of the Keys, which is the first chapter where we see Hagrid in it. And so in the Letters from No One, we don't completely find out what everything's all about, but in the Keeper of the, we know something is going on in the Letters from No One. Something is happening that is changing Harry's life. So we already are getting the call to adventure. But it really solidifies in chapter 4, the Keeper of the Keys, because now we actually know what's happening. You know, Harry's a wizard. He's invited to go away to school. He doesn't have to live with his relatives anymore. And here's this guy who's a wizard half giant, to tell him this. So we find out this deluge of information right in those couple chapters, but that's what pulls us into the story. That's the inciting incident. And that sort of functions as the call to adventure in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. The 3rd stage of the hero's journey is called Refusal of the Call, because most good heroes are they're not assholes, let's put it that way. So if you can imagine that if you told someone like, oh yeah, you're totally a celebrity, or you're totally a wizard, or you've inherited $1 million. Now, if that person said immediately, I always knew it, you know, I'm just special, I'm just awesome, that's me. If they said that, we would kind of be like, ugh, I don't really want to read the rest of the book that you're in. So instead, usually for our hero to be likable and for their journey and their quest to be relatable and acceptable and believable, they have to have some hesitation along the way. And this can be really small, or it could take a longer time. In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the refusal of the call is really brief. In the Keeper of the Keys chapter, when Hagrid first tells Harry he's a wizard, he says, what, me? You can't be serious. Basically, Harry doesn't believe it at first. And he doesn't just believe it because it's fantastical, because he's already seen that these letters have somehow come into this building in the craziest ways possible. So it's not just that it's unbelievable from like a fantastical point of view. He doesn't completely believe it because he's modest and he thinks that he's not special. And that kind of endears Harry more to us, because we relate more to someone who doesn't think the world of themselves and has to be convinced of something just a little bit. So the refusal of the call, the 3rd stage, is often kind of necessary. At least has the protagonist, the hero, should probably have at least a moment of hesitation, so that we can kind of put ourselves in their shoes and see where they're coming from, and sort of feel like they're not arrogant and they're not just some blustering person who's just gonna go on a quest. Now, the 4th stage of the hero's journey is called Meeting the Mentor. And in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, now, if you're familiar with Harry Potter, you might at first think, well, obviously that's gotta be Dumbledore, Professor Dumbledore, because he's old and he has long white hair and he's obviously the mentor of it. Well, okay. You could argue that Dumbledore overall is one of the bigger sort of mentor figures of the entire series. That's true. But in the first book, the main mentor that Harry has, at least in the first half of the book, is Hagrid, not Dumbledore. And so in chapter 5, the Diagon Alley chapter, so it starts in the Keeper of the Keys chapter 4, and then continues in chapter 5. Hagrid introduces Harry to this whole magical world that Harry didn't know about, that he's actually a part of, that he's a really big part of, because he's the chosen one. And explains to him, he explains to Harry about Harry's past and about the world itself, but he also gives Harry some like sort of general advice and moral advice about sort of what to do and what not to do and things like that. At least in this first book, Hagrid functions sort of as the mentor figure, especially earlier on, at least for this sort of hero's journey setup we've got going on. Hagrid also in the mentor stage, there's usually a collection of necessary supplies, gaining of certain knowledge, also perhaps an increase of confidence for the journey. And I think during the Diagon Alley chapter and maybe in the second half of the Keeper of the Keys chapter, Hagrid totally fulfills this role for Harry, gets him all his school books, teaches him sort of the general know-how, the way of the world, and so he serves that purpose. Now, you could argue later on in the book, Dumbledore sort of does coach Harry a little bit more, but Dumbledore is kind of a background figure in the first book. He comes into greater prominence in the later books. So the mentor, at least here, I think is Hagrid. If you want to find out what happens next, stay tuned. More magic to come, but this video is too long for now, so I'm going to cut it into pieces.